The Forbidden Symbol. How Princess Anne and Prince William weaponized constitutional safeguards at Balmoral to defend Princess Diana's material legacy against Queen Camilla. The carefully manufactured facade of institutional unity at the absolute summit of the British monarchy suffered a catastrophic internal collapse inside the private drawing rooms of Balmoral Castle. For decades, the administrative managers of the royal household have relied on the isolation of the Scottish Highlands to quietly contain deep family fractures, operating under the assumption that historical grievances could be systematically managed, diluted, or explained away in the name of sovereign duty. But during a private evening gathering designed to project stability after months of behind-the-scenes friction, that polished cover was entirely shattered by the sudden appearance of a single, highly restricted piece of jewelry. Princess Anne, working in absolute strategic alignment with Prince William, did not rely on standard palace channels or diplomatic intermediaries to handle this violation. Instead, she initiated a direct, chillingly controlled confrontation that effectively stripped Queen Camilla of her administrative confidence and established an unyielding new constitutional boundary around the material legacy of Princess Diana. This unprecedented collision has not only permanently altered the internal hierarchy of the House of Windsor, but has signaled a decisive transfer of moral and territorial authority toward the direct line of succession. To fully comprehend the magnitude of this confrontation, one must trace the precise mechanics of the trap that Queen Camilla inadvertently walked into. The gathering at Balmoral was not a casual weekend retreat. It was an incredibly deliberate diplomatic exercise orchestrated by the palace to consolidate the standing of the newly structured court. King Charles III wanted a calm, controlled environment to reinforce his authority. Queen Camilla wanted to demonstrate her absolute domestic dignity, and Prince William had agreed to participate on the fundamental understanding that certain historic lines would be strictly respected. For years, William had carried his profound grief not as a public political weapon, but as a deeply protected personal wound, trusting that the institution would never allow his late mother's memory to be exploited for personal validation or rank. That trust evaporated the moment Princess Anne's eyes settled on Camilla's hand. The queen consort was wearing a highly controversial ring that was inextricably tied to Princess Diana, an object that represented the deepest psychological wounds of William's youth, reintroduced into the family circle at the worst possible historical moment. The tactical response from Princess Anne was characterized by a cold, unwavering discipline that completely paralyzed the room before a single word was officially spoken. Instead of causing a dramatic scene or allowing the confrontation to devolve into an emotional family argument, Anne used a weapon far more terrifying to the palace elite: absolute, punitive silence. She deliberately set her teacup down with a slow, heavy finality, focusing her gaze entirely on Camilla's hand, forcing every senior member of the family to acknowledge the forbidden symbol sitting openly on the table. The reaction within the room was instantaneous and profound. Queen Camilla, suddenly realizing that her calculated display of historical possession had been detected, attempted to quietly shift her hand toward her lap to conceal the artifact, but the defensive movement came far too late. Prince William saw the ring. Catherine saw the immediate structural change in her husband's posture, and King Charles witnessed the entire dynamic unfold without possessing the administrative courage to intervene or offer a swift explanation. The silence that enveloped the drawing room at Balmoral was not a symptom of confusion. It was the heavy, suffocating realization that a definitive boundary of royal respect had been aggressively crossed. For Prince William, the sight of that specific ring entering the sovereign space of Balmoral without explicit permission was not a mere breach of etiquette. It was a raw, visceral confrontation with a past he had spent a lifetime learning how to navigate. The palace advisors had spent 20 years trying to soften the history of the late 1990s, attempting to sanitize the transition of royal assets and rewrite the narrative surrounding Princess Diana's displacement. Yet, by allowing that ring to appear at a private family gathering, the court had inadvertently brought the full weight of Diana's shadow right back to the table. Catherine stayed close to William, providing a calm, protective anchor, but both of them recognized that this was no longer a moment for gentle diplomatic compromises. Certain historic violations demand immediate, uncompromising institutional protection, and Princess Anne was already preparing to deliver the opening command. The structural devastation of this confrontation lay in the fact that the shock was not distributed equally among those who sat around the table, exposing the massive administrative fault lines that run through the modern House of Windsor. For Queen Camilla, The ring was intended to be an unvocalized symbol of final victory, a quiet assertion of her absolute domestic and historical position at the side of the sovereign. For Princess Anne, however, it was a blatant, calculated violation of a direct constitutional pact designed to maintain the psychological peace of the reigning family. For Prince William, it was a deep emotional wound reopened in the most clinical, public manner possible within his own family circle. While for Catherine, it represented the sudden, cold realization that a supposed gathering of unity had been transformed into an absolute institutional battlefield. King Charles III remained frozen at the head of the table, trapped in the one historical silence he could no longer manage, manipulate, or control through the standard machinery of palace public relations. When Princess Anne finally chose to terminate the silence, her voice carried the low, unyielding vibration of an absolute executive order, completely bypassing the defensive authority of the king. She did not raise her tone or indulge in theatrical anger. Instead, she delivered a chillingly precise question that stripped the room of any remaining diplomatic pretense. She turned her gaze directly upon the queen consort and demanded to know why a highly restricted divert inextricably bound to the memory of Princess Diana was sitting openly upon her hand. Camilla immediately looked toward King Charles, silently waiting for a swift sovereign rescue to soften the moment. But the monarch hesitated. That single, agonizing hesitation told the entire room everything they needed to know. This was no longer a simple misunderstanding or a casual error in styling. It was a direct, calculated challenge to the invisible boundaries that protect the direct line of succession, and by failing to immediately defend his wife's choice, the king inadvertently signaled that the moral authority of the room had shifted entirely to his sister and his eldest son. To fully understand why this confrontation was entirely unavoidable, one must look past the immediate tension of the Balmoral drawing room and examine a hidden, highly sensitive administrative ceremony that had occurred weeks earlier within the private vaults of Windsor Castle. This ceremony, known within the inner household as the Windsor Inventory Review, was an incredibly strict, legally monitored process designed to permanently settle the distribution of historical royal assets and protect the private belongings of Princess Diana from ever being weaponized or used for personal positioning. Prince William had entered that archive room with an intensely guarded posture, with Catherine remaining at his side to navigate the profound psychological weight of watching his mother's most personal possessions being systematically handled, categorized, and sorted by palace officials who viewed these objects merely as items of national history rather than containers of immense family grief. During that specific Windsor review, a sealed tray containing the most sensitive, emotionally charged pieces of jewelry linked to the late Princess of Wales was officially unlocked before the immediate family. It was during this administrative procedure that the controversial ring was first presented for evaluation. Prince William had gone entirely still upon seeing the artifact, his countenance revealing a silent, protective fury that his voice chose to withhold. Princess Anne had watched the future king's reaction with meticulous attention, her jaw tightening as Queen Camilla openly questioned why certain historical memories had to be treated by the institution as completely untouchable. Camilla's verbal intervention had landed catastrophically with the future monarch. William refused to offer her a direct response, choosing instead to rely on a cold, absolute non-communication that signaled a permanent institutional line had been drawn. Anne had stepped forward immediately, using her immense constitutional weight to dictate that the ring must be marked as permanently restricted, meaning it was legally banned from ever being displayed, worn in public, or utilized by anyone to validate their current rank within the family hierarchy. The historical significance of that restricted classification was reinforced by a subsequent discovery made by a senior palace official within the documented household accounts. Following the conclusion of that Windsor review, Princess Anne had returned to the private archive room alone, driven by a characteristic instinct for absolute verification. When she stared into the inventory case, she discovered that the restricted container holding the ring was no longer sitting in its designated position. The space was entirely empty. That crucial moment turned her concern into an absolute administrative certainty. Someone within the palace apparatus had deliberately bypassed the constitutional restrictions to remove the artifact. Therefore, when Queen Camilla chose to display that exact ring on her hand during the private gathering at Balmoral, Princess Anne was not reacting out of sudden emotional surprise. She was reacting to physical proof of an intentional, coordinated violation of an established institutional boundary. Faced with this overt defiance, Princess Anne refused to allow the palace machinery to bury the violation in private memos or diplomatic excuses. She bypassed every layer of palace procedure, turning her gaze directly upon Queen Camilla to demand an immediate explanation before the assembled family. Camilla, attempting to regain control before the silence completely undermined her position, weakly defended her actions by describing the ring as a standard family heirloom, an item of historical property that had simply passed through private royal hands. But the explanation carried absolutely no institutional weight in a room where the direct heirs to that legacy were sitting. Prince William remained completely motionless, his silent gaze fixed upon Camilla's hand as if the mere presence of the ring for another second was an unacceptable insult to his mother's dignity. Catherine watched the interaction with a sharp, protective focus, fully understanding that William was not trying to create drama, but was actively exercising immense psychological restraint to prevent a total rupture within the sovereign circle. The tension escalated further as Princess Anne stepped closer, maintaining a terrifyingly calm and controlled posture that only amplified the severity of her intervention. She pointed directly at the ring, informing the queen consort in a low, unwavering tone that certain sacred symbols were not personal prizes to be worn for domestic validation or status. Camilla, visibly shaken by the directness of the critique, glanced anxiously toward King Charles, a single desperate look that completely altered the political temperature of the room. That glance suggested to everyone present that the decision to remove the ring from the Windsor vaults may not have belonged to Camilla alone, hinting at a deeper, unvocalized authorization from the king himself. Anne immediately turned the focus of her investigation upon the monarch, demanding to know if he had personally approved this violation of the Windsor inventory protocol. This direct challenge completely neutralized the effectiveness of standard palace procedure, transforming a routine family gathering into an existential test of sovereign trust. King Charles found himself entirely trapped between his present marriage and an unyielding historical memory that no crown could bury. For years, the king had utilized his administrative authority to prevent past family traumas from complicating his modern reign, but the combined strategy of Princess Anne and Prince William had forced the unvarnished truth directly onto his table. As every eye in the room locked onto the monarch, the structural reality of the crisis became painfully simple. The king was forced to make a defining choices between protecting his wife's domestic pride or defending the sacred material legacy of Princess Diana. King Charles III had spent an entire lifetime learning how to navigate impossible rooms, but this specific drawing room at Balmoral presented a constitutional crisis that no amount of polished diplomatic rhetoric could resolve. There was no grand sovereign speech that could erase the physical presence of the ring from Camilla's hand, no royal decree that could soften the profound injury inflicted upon Prince William, and no private explanation that could satisfy Princess Anne's intense demands for accountability. For the first time since his accession to the throne, the monarch looked less like an absolute ruler and more like an administrative captive trapped between two competing eras of family history. The immense strain on the king's face revealed his absolute understanding of the tactical trap he occupied. If he moved too quickly to defend Queen Camilla, he would permanently alienate the future king, but if he challenged her choices too openly, he would publicly humiliate the queen consort beyond institutional repair. While formal authority still belonged to the monarch, Princess Anne had successfully seized absolute moral control of the room because everyone present recognized she was defending a foundational boundary that the palace had been terrified to name. Prince William completely altered the political balance of the confrontation without uttering a single word. He carried the memory of Princess Diana not as a chapter of national history to be managed by palace aides, but as a living, uncompromised son's inheritance. This reality meant that the controversial ring did not merely touch an old tabloid headline. It directly assaulted his private grief, a sacred space where the sovereign's administrative writ did not run. King Charles watched Catherine watch William, and in that silent exchange, the king recognized that the dispute was no longer only about a piece of jewelry. It was an ultimate test of whether William could ever trust his father to protect what remained sacred to the direct line of succession. As Queen Camilla sat rigidly at the table, realizing that her calculated display of historical possession had exposed her to an unprecedented domestic trial, Princess Anne moved in for the final tactical strike. She formally reminded King Charles of the explicit Windsor inventory instruction, the legally binding private note that had officially categorized Princess Diana's ring as a restricted asset, explicitly barred from casual use, display, or personal adornment. This reminder shifted the entire conflict from an emotional family argument into a matter of strict institutional accountability. Anne demanded that the official note be retrieved immediately, forcing the king to send a private aide into the palace offices to secure the file. When the aide returned and placed the folded document before the monarch, the room seemed to tighten to an absolute breaking point. This was no longer a dispute built on subjective feelings. It was undeniable physical proof that a definitive legal line had been drawn before the family ever arrived in Scotland. King Charles picked up his reading glasses, reviewed the strict terms of his mother's inventory instruction, and then placed them down without speaking for several agonizing seconds. The silence within the Balmoral drawing room became entirely unbearable. As the reigning sovereign, Charles possessed the technical authority to dismiss his sister's intervention and validate his wife's actions. But he chose to do neither. Princess Anne recognized the strategic meaning of this pause before anyone else did. The king's silence was his official surrender. He was not going to intervene to stop her. And the moment the family realized that the monarch would not weaponize his authority to protect Queen Camilla from the consequences of the violation, the carefully planned Balmoral gathering began to collapse in real time. The final collapse of the Balmoral gathering did not manifest through dramatic public shouting, but through the cold, methodical shifting of chairs, the opening of heavy doors, and the quiet departure of senior family members before the king could officially dismiss them. Balmoral had witnessed profound grief, sudden illness, and historic state decisions over the centuries, but it had never seen a family confrontation where a single physical object exposed the deep strategic fractures they had spent years trying to conceal beneath the cover of sovereign duty. Queen Camilla slowly, painfully removed the controversial ring from her hand, her countenance turning entirely pale as she confronted the devastating humiliation of realizing that the entire room, including the monarch, had turned against her gesture. Princess Anne did not look away, maintaining her disciplined focus until the artifact was completely out of sight. Prince William stepped back from the table with the quiet, stunned grief of a son who had just watched his mother's sacred memory utilized as a claim of contemporary rank. He exited the drawing room into the long corridor, with Catherine following closely behind to provide a protective, unyielding anchor against the psychological toll of the evening. William kept his voice low, but the intense pain inside his words was unmistakable as he whispered to his wife that seeing the ring on Camilla's hand felt like losing Princess Diana's dignity all over again. Catherine understood precisely why the moment had breached his formidable defenses. Diana was not a distant figure in royal history to her husband, but his mother, and any careless manipulation of her legacy was a direct assault on the line of succession itself. Behind them in the drawing room, King Charles remained entirely isolated, trapped within the heavy silence he had helped create, watching his wife fold her fingers around the empty space where her borrowed authority had just collapsed. To ensure that this violation could never be repeated, Princess Anne issued an absolute command that the ring be placed into secure custody before any member of the family left the Scottish estate. In strict administrative terms, this meant transferring the artifact to a highly protected, biologically monitored family holding vault where sensitive historic items could not be accessed, moved, or displayed without explicit, multi-tiered sovereign approval. Camilla placed the ring into a small velvet pouch, and the sharp sound of the metal clasp closing signaled the definitive end of her court's campaign to absorb Diana's material legacy. When Prince William returned briefly to the room, he did not look at Camilla. Instead, he exchanged a silent, profound look of recognition with Princess Anne, an unspoken pact that permanently transferred the moral guardianship of the House of Windsor to those who respect its foundational boundaries. By sunrise, the story of the Balmoral confrontation had completely escaped the castle walls, bypassing the elaborate filters of palace communications to dominate the public imagination of the entire United Kingdom. The king's media teams moved aggressively to reduce the national headlines to a mere administrative misunderstanding. But the public refused to accept the sanitized explanation, recognizing the incident as an epic battle over memory, respect, and institutional honor. Front pages across London displayed close-up images of the ringed hand beside explosive headlines declaring that Diana's shadow had returned to dismantle the confidence of the new reign. Outside Kensington Palace, the historic London residence inextricably linked to the late Princess of Wales, silent crowds began to gather, leaving white flowers at the gates as a direct, visible display of absolute loyalty to Prince William and his mother's enduring legacy. In the final assessment, the historic events of that evening established an unyielding new constitutional rule within the British monarchy. Any item or asset closely linked to the material inheritance of Princess Diana will now require the direct, explicit, and written approval of Prince William and Catherine before any future public use. This private rule has effectively given grief a permanent, veto-wielding voice inside a palace system built to prioritize cold administrative procedure over human emotion. Queen Camilla left Scotland profoundly wounded. Her domestic strategy completely neutralized in front of the entire family, while Prince William achieved a measure of deep psychological peace because a definitive boundary had finally been defended without apology. As the family departed the Highlands, the verdict remained mathematically absolute. The legacy of Princess Diana cannot be absorbed, borrowed, or worn by anyone who has not earned the historical right to carry its immense weight, ensuring that the future of the monarchy remains firmly in the custody of its rightful protectors. The constitutional reckoning of the Balmoral confrontation has permanently reshaped the trajectory of the House of Windsor, serving as an absolute turning point for the modern British monarchy. By forcing the King's Court to retreat under the combined legal and moral pressure of Princess Anne and Prince William, the direct line of succession has established an ironclad administrative perimeter around its own emotional history. The strict guidelines enacted following the retrieval of the Windsor inventory file mean that the palace's central communications apparatus can no longer quietly reclassify or repurpose historical artifacts to serve the facts-blank, image-building agendas of individual members. This historic victory has fundamentally proved that the Crown's executive power is not absolute, but remains stringently bound by the principles of domestic respect, historical truth, and the unyielding rights of a son to protect his mother's dignity. As King Charles III continues to govern within a streamlined, modernized framework, he must now operate alongside a powerful and unified internal alliance that controls the moral architecture of the family. The quiet but absolute cooperation between Princess Anne, the Prince of Wales, and the Duchess of Edinburgh has created an unbreakable defensive front that successfully immunizes the late Queen Elizabeth's promises from any unilateral sovereign revision. This domestic shift ensures that as the monarchy moves toward its eventual transition, it will do so with its historical integrity intact, protected from short-term strategic maneuvers or opportunistic campaigns. The grand chessboard of Balmoral has frozen into a definitive alignment, leaving no doubt that while the king may hold the administrative scepter, the true spiritual custody of the crown has already passed into the secure hands of the future. This conclusive victory over the palace's centralizing ambitions has sent a profound, permanent shockwave through the entire infrastructure of the British state, sending a clear signal to every courtier, advisor, and administrative secretary within the sovereign apparatus. For decades, the institutional machinery at Buckingham Palace had operated under the lazy assumption that the younger generation of royals would continuously sacrifice their personal dignity and emotional boundaries to maintain an artificial public illusion of family harmony. Prince William, bolstered by the strategic brilliance of Princess Anne and the quiet, unwavering support of Catherine, has completely dismantled that antiquated doctrine, proving that the modern line of succession will no longer allow its private history to be bartered for institutional convenience or contemporary political styling. The unyielding boundaries established on that historic evening have effectively insulated the material and emotional legacy of Princess Diana from any future administrative overreach, ensuring that the memory of the late Princess of Wales will forever remain a sacred, untouchable inheritance held strictly within the custody of her rightful heirs. As the House of Windsor looks toward an uncertain future under a smaller, increasingly isolated court, the profound moral authority seized by the Prince of Wales at Balmoral stands as a definitive blueprint for the next era of the British monarchy. By forcing Charles Vavung Camilla to formally accept a restrictive veto over the distribution of historic family assets, William has subtly but irrevocably shifted the true center of gravity within the institution away from the reigning sovereign and directly toward the future throne. This quiet, internal realignment has sent a powerful wave of reassurance to a British public that still holds the memory of Princess Diana close to its heart, demonstrating that the future king possesses the absolute discipline, moral clarity, and protective courage necessary to govern the nation's most sacred traditions. Long after the dramatic headlines of 2026 have faded into the annals of constitutional history, the silent coup at Balmoral will be remembered as the defining moment when the rightful protectors of the crown stepped out of the shadows of the past to permanently claim their sovereign destiny.